Hi everyone, my name is Jonathan Evershed. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of English and Digital Humanities at University College Cork, and also the Vice President of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies. And it's my great pleasure on behalf of both IACES and UACES to welcome you all to this second of three joint seminars that we are hosting, examining key and critical issues for the UK, Ireland and EU at a time of overlapping political, cultural and economic crises. Today we're here to examine and interrogate and confront racism in the UK, Ireland and the EU. Recent events, not least the global pandemic, but before it, the so-called migrant crisis, the politics of austerity, Brexit, among other things, have all demonstrated in striking ways the forms of structural racism which define contemporary British, Irish, and wider European politics. And today, as I've said, we're seeking to confront and unpack racism in and across these three political communities and examine the role of the European studies community across these islands in particular, but also, of course, more widely across Europe. Examine the role that this European studies community can play in dismantling systems, or seeking to dismantle systems of oppression and exclusion. And it's my great privilege to have been asked to chair today's session with colleagues, leading scholars and activists working in the field of anti-racism. It's a real privilege to be in this position to chair today's discussion. We're joined for today's seminar by Nima Begum at the University of Manchester, by Amanullah Dasondi at University College Cork, Shada Islam, who is an independent analyst and commentator, Kay Kelly Ponyon at the Quaker Council for European Affairs, and Bashir Otukoya at Dublin City University and University College Dublin. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to offer some initial reflections on the challenge of racism and confronting the challenge of racism in the UK, Ireland, and or the EU, or all three. I propose that we go in the order in which I've introduced the speakers, and I will give, as I've said, a fuller introduction to each of those speakers in turn. Those speakers will talk in the first instance, offering their initial reflections for around 8 minutes. We'll then move into some discussion amongst the panelists and some questions. I've already got several, and I've no doubt we'll have more after these contributions, and then we'll move into questions from the what more widely from the floor, if you will. I hope I haven't missed anything. If I have, Emily, please feel free to drop it into the chat if I've missed anything important, and I'll flag it after I've introduced, or after the contribution from our first speaker this afternoon. And our first speaker this afternoon is Nima Begum at the University of Manchester. Nima is a political scientist researching ethnic minority voting, political participation and representation. She is a research associate at the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity. So with no further ado, over to you, Nima, and thanks again for joining us this afternoon.
Hey, hi everyone. Thank you for the kind invitation and the kind introduction. So I'll give a, oh, sorry, you can hear me okay, right? Okay, great. So I think I'll just raise a few points that I think are important and keep it brief because I want to hear from the other panelists. So I thought I'd start by mentioning the Sewell report that came out earlier this year in April, which was commissioned by the government, and the report findings didn't go down well with anti-racism campaigners and I think a lot of minority communities, when they concluded that there was little evidence of persistent or pervasive racism in the UK. So this is one of the big challenges that we have around challenging racism. Wait, sorry, that was a bit, I mean, yeah, this is one of the challenges that we have with actually convincing people that racism does exist. And usually the terms of the debate are framed by white people or white people in power who don't have as big a stake, or they're not probably they're invested in the existing structures and usually have the power to define racism when they don't experience it themselves. And a lot of the time, racism is thought of in terms of individual perspectives or individual failings rather than structural. So we've seen with the pandemic that ethnic minorities and minoritized groups are particularly affected. There've been much higher rates of death among Asian and Black people in the UK, for example, and sometimes this has been attributed to ethnicity or kind of inherent differences rather than structural challenges and inequalities that exist. A lot of ethnic minorities are on the front line of the NHS. A lot of ethnic minorities are in low-paying jobs and in occupations that have been on the front line of fighting the pandemic. So I'm going to do a quick plug for the EVEN survey, if that's okay. So at the University of Manchester in the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, we're doing a survey which is called the Evidence for Equality National Survey, otherwise known as EVENS, and we're surveying up to 10,000 ethnic minorities in Britain on their experiences of the COVID pandemic, how the health, financial and social impacts of the pandemic, as well as policing around the pandemic. And speaking of policing, last year we had the Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd. This has really resonated around the world among Black communities and people of colour, and the kind of policing practices that are targeted against minority communities and the police brutality that Black communities specifically face. So I wanted to broaden the focus slightly on Europe as a whole, and so it's been, I think it's the 5th year anniversary, it was yesterday, of Britain voting to leave the EU. So for my PhD, I did interviews and focus groups with Black and Asian people in the UK and their reasons for voting to remain or leave the EU. So what I found that even though the majority of ethnic minorities in Britain, 2/3 voted to remain in the EU, there was generally weak identification with Europeanness amongst British Black and Asian people. So this might not be all that surprising, given that European identification tends to be weak in the UK population as a whole, but a lot of British ethnic minorities talked about European as being a white identity, and that it wasn't something that they necessarily identified with, whereas British was seen as a more open civic identity that was more acquirable, whereas European was a more exclusive. Sorry, I just saw a message that I'm a bit muffled. Sorry, shall I speak a bit louder? Is that better? Okay, yeah. So what I was what I found was that a lot of ethnic minorities in Britain didn't identify as European. The majority voted Remain, not necessarily as strong supporters of the EU and what the EU represents, but it had a lot to do with the racism and xenophobia that they perceived on the Leave side. But also, there was Euroscepticism among British ethnic minorities, including those who supported Remain, around the EU and what the EU represents. It's mainly talked about in terms of the border politics of the EU and freedom of movement, which a lot of them found to be discriminatory against people from outside of Europe. So even though there's freedom of movement within European borders, the borders around Europe are heavily fortified and policed, and the refugee crisis was raised quite a lot in terms of how the EU has worked hard or is working hard to keep Muslim and Black refugees out of Europe. And the kind of practices of Frontex and other agencies in the treatment of refugees and the harsh anti-trafficking laws that are brought against volunteers trying to help refugees, and Frontex actively trying to push back refugee boats and so on. So in terms of Europe and Britain and rising diversity within Europe, so the 2021 census this year will show the extent of how racial and ethnic diversity and religious diversity has increased in the UK. So we have growing ethnic minority, second generation, third generation groups within Europe, and when a lot of the quote unquote culture wars and the discourses around diversity and Muslims in Europe is very hostile. We've also seen a lot of far-right parties and far-right politics is gaining ground, especially online. And there's been the circulation of this great replacement conspiracy theory that the white majority is slowly decreasing, and that the minorities will go on to become the majority. I mean, that's not going to happen for a few hundred years, I think, but there's a concern already about this happening, and the implication that violence is being enacted against white majorities is really dangerous and is used to demonize minority groups when they are often the most oppressed and the most marginalized. So I'll end by coming back to Britain and the legacy of colonialism and how that's being debated. Recently, last year, we saw the statue of Colston in Bristol taken down by activists and thrown in the harbour. And now, recently, the statue was exhibited in a museum in Bristol, and there's a lot of conversations around Churchill and Gladwell and different slave owners of the past who've been memorialized and have different streets and buildings and lots of places around Britain named after them, and what that means for people of colour having to seeing slave owners being commemorated and seen as philanthropists. So there's criticisms of Rhodes Must Fall and other movements to bring down statues of slave owners, that they're trying to rewrite history. But I think we rewrite history when we think of slave owners as philanthropists. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thanks, Nima, for that really excellent comprehensive overview of kind of the state of play, in the UK and in Europe more widely. These questions about Europeanness and whiteness, I think, are fascinating and raise important questions, including for what remains, I suppose, of the kind of Continuity Remain campaign, which I've been quite critical of, as well as for so there's some stuff there that I hope we can kind of return to and revisit.
Sorry if anyone couldn't hear me properly. I can repeat anything.
If anyone needs anything repeated, do drop it into the chat. But I certainly heard everything, and you were particularly crisp and clear from after Emily, I imagine, gave that little nudge. So no problem. I heard everything at this end anyway. Thank you very much, Nima. Our next speaker is Amanullah Dasondi at University College Cork. Amanullah is a senior lecturer in contemporary Islam and head of the Study of Religions department at University College Cork. He's the author of, among other of his published works, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, an introduction to monotheism, and the crisis of Islamic masculinities. He's also the chair of UCC's Race Equality Forum, and I think is going to offer some reflections more particularly about Ireland, although better to say over to you, Aman, and thank you for joining us, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Just want to confirm, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. I'd firstly like to thank you, Jonathan, and the organisers of the IACES and the UACES for this joint seminar looking at UK, Ireland and the European Union in a time of crisis as we look at confronting and countering racism. When I arrived in Cork in 2015, one of my earliest conversations left me worried that moving here from Miami was a mistake. I had raised the question of race and racism in Ireland generally and Cork in particular, and was abruptly told that these were all USA issues, that I should now leave them behind. I was left scratching my head when I learned that at that time, the university had no data collected on race or ethnicity. We don't see race. The university accepts everyone, went one response. Now, a lot has changed since then, but the real impact of racism is evident at many levels of Irish society. In my 10 minutes or so, I wish to combine some personal insights with some constructive changes that are happening and how we can strengthen an anti-racist Irish society that thrives on the idea that we can be different and equal. Now, granted, race is not biological. We are all the same in that regard, but we do know through our histories and social realities that race has a very real impact in all of our lives. I was born and raised in Glasgow, where issues of race were rarely talked about, but no matter how many times I've worn a kilt, there's always someone who asks that dreaded question, but where are you really from? The way race organizes society teaches us about the structural foundations of social power. Even though we long ago divided our worlds between East and West and North and South, all is not lost. Now, more than ever before, we are having an open debate and discussion right here in Ireland. This pandemic has been a great teacher to us. It has illustrated that there is a pandemic on a pandemic. Black, Asian, minority ethnic Irish folks are physically and mentally burdened, but they're also burdened not just with COVID-19, but also with racism. The number of racist incidents reported to the Irish Network Against Racism jumped to 700 last year, a 32% increase from 2019. The report is a catalogue of ghastly accounts of racist abuse suffered by people all over this country. There was a Chinese woman who was racially abused and pushed into a canal by teenagers. There is racial discrimination in the workplace. And the one that really got me was a pharmacy telling a South Asian they had no hand sanitizers, but then selling it a short while later to white Irish customers. I am personally struck by these accounts. I thought about my parents who came from Pakistan in the 1960s to the UK. My mother has very limited English, And I think of the privileges I hold today as someone safe and secure in a university system. Yet here I am still receiving death threats to my office phone. How did we get here in Ireland? I worry for the vulnerable individuals on our streets, people out there who have been harmed because of racism in Ireland. It has highlighted many subjects that we have avoided here in Ireland, especially race. Being vulnerable and disempowered have effects, but many of us carry privileges and can access networks or social statuses that allow us to not see certain matters. But COVID-19 has left us all vulnerable, whether rich or poor, white or black. We have all had to deal with lockdown. The uncertainty of death and all sorts of curbs on our freedom. The May 25, 2020 death of George Floyd by police brutality left us all stunned. We know this wasn't the first time a black man had been killed in such a way, but there was something powerful in how his particular death shook us all, and all at once. We could all feel the cries for help he made to his mum. We felt connected to George as we watched his funeral live on our TV screens, and it moved us all. Here, locally in Cork, I've walked past a mural at Sullivan's Quay that boldly states, "Black Lives Matter, end direct provision." Never did I think a massive, expressive statement like this would surface so near to my university, which only recently started a conversation on race. But every time I pass it, I smile and think how special Cork is, of course. To me, it is a symbol of raising awareness that we are all in this together, that together we can unite on matters that concern us. It is recognition that Ireland has seen a twofold rise in inward migration, and that we need to find ways of bridging our divides. Race is well and truly an issue that has been brought into the spotlight here in Ireland. I have been pleasantly surprised by how much news coverage has been dedicated to the many stories that we previously failed to appreciate. Now that's the thing about diversity. Appreciating our differences and living equally side by side in those differences enriches our society, every society. We don't all have to be the same, and we are learning that Irishness is made up of a multitude of colours, and that is exciting. If there's anything we should be learning from our recent discussions, it is this. Just as we need to accept different identities and ways of living in our society, we all need to feel at home in our spaces, no matter how contested they are. We must let our spaces reflect the values we profess in word and deed. Now, here at the university, the Race Equality Forum is an initiative of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Unit and the Equality Committee. The Race Equality Forum was established in 2019 as a way to engage directly with staff and students of colour and ethnic minority in the university, to draft proposals that would form part of an embedded programme of action for the university. The forum was set up with two co-chairs. I am one of them, one internal and one external. Our external co-chair is from the Irish Traveller Communities. And all participants are people of colour within the Race Equality Forum or minority ethnicity. Part of this initiative was to hold online live conversations with an audience. And these conversations have provided staff and students the opportunity to share their lived experiences of inequality, racism, and other negative experiences in safe yet open environments. So to conclude, this pandemic is giving us this chance to recognise our differences and their effects on society, but simultaneously to draw closer to one another. I'm thankful to public reminders like the Black Lives Matter mural in Sullivan's Quay, right here in Cork, which allows us to think globally and act locally, which entreat me to accept the challenge continually, repeatedly, with others by my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanullah. Very powerful. The reminder, I think, that crises also present opportunities, that this pandemic on a pandemic presents an opportunity for change and for transformation, which I think is a very powerful thing that you've evoked for us this afternoon. Our next contribution will be from Shada Islam. Shada is an independent analyst and commentator, a senior advisor at the European Policy Centre and visiting professor at the College of Europe at Natolin. She is a respected and well-known commentator on European affairs, specializing in the EU's relations with Asia and Africa, and more widely in geopolitics, trade, and the politics of inclusion. And thank you for joining us this afternoon. Shada, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very important discussion. So telling the story, I mean, I've been really moved by what Amanullah and Nima have said, and many of these points they've made resonate here. I'm in Brussels, so the heart of the European Union, with the headquarters just not very far from where I live. So I'm going to try and focus on, I think, about 9 points, and I want to start off really with a little bit of optimism, because it may sound very silly in the wider global context, but what is, I think, a matter of some rejoicing for me is that finally, we are beginning to have conversations about race, discrimination, police violence, ethno-nationalism, colonialism and slavery. All of these questions, friends, have been taboo in Europe, in the European Union institutions for as long as I can remember. And I've been following the EU for about 3 decades now. These conversations are sometimes sotto voce, they're in whispers, but at least they have started. Because until now, EU policymakers lived in a kind of a magical world, a kind of Disney fairy tale world, where everyone was colorblind, everything worked on the basis of merit, and of course, there was no such thing as racism. And several arguments were deployed to talk about diversity and inclusion. The first argument you always hear, and I'm sure Kikeli will back me up on, is that we are diverse. We're a union of 27 countries, so we bring all the diversity that we need of cultures and religions and diversity of all kinds. We are diverse. And then the second argument you hear is colonialism and slavery. Well, you know, the EU per se is a virgin birth. That is the problem of member states. Yes, France and Germany and Belgium, but the EU is a new union, and it has nothing to do with the past. So kind of, as I said, a virgin birth. And then when questions were about diversity, it was always about gender. Now, I'm a feminist myself, and I'm a great believer in feminism and the need for having more women in jobs and better representation in policy and feminist foreign policy, if you like. But that was considered to be the only priority. And to be quite frank, the EU's done quite well so far, much to do, but on gender diversity. So the questions that I have been asking for about 25 years on diversity in terms of racial diversity, racial justice, ethnic diversity, the rights of Europeans of color, minorities, all of these questions had always been shrugged off. And I was told in no uncertain terms that this was a distraction. This was not the work of the European Union. And behind it was this sentiment that, of course, Europeans of color are really not European. They're foreigners, exotic, and tolerated, and, you know, welcome when they can actually contribute sometimes to our economy. But really, they're just here as guest workers, you know, the German sense of it. So all of this was, of course, rooted in the French system, which is about, you know, a universal egalitarianism where you don't recognize race, and you pretend, as we all know, that it does not exist. And also, of course, the German post-racial consciousness, if you like, raised by the horrible tragedy of the Holocaust. But then things began to change, and I have to say, like Amanullah, it was the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests and the demonstrations that erupted across the European capitals, here in Brussels as well. And I think EU policymakers in their little towers, you know, in the little bubble, were actually, I could see, taken by surprise that there were Europeans out there in the street saying, we too cannot breathe. And, you know, there were some enormous blunders that were made initially. I've written about it for The Guardian, among other newspapers, but it was just a wake-up call. And so the second point also made by Amanullah and Nima Begum are, of course, about the pandemic. And that was something that also was raised very quickly in our conversation about the fact that the pandemic actually was hitting minorities very hard because of inequalities that existed, but also that many of the frontline workers, essential workers, the majority actually were actually from the ethnic communities, were Europeans of color and were migrants as well. So there was that second, if you like, recognition. And so the European Union started responding at first very gingerly and cautiously, but then actually did a few things that I hadn't even dreamt of, you know, when I was talking about this. So they came up with an anti-racism action plan. For the first time ever, there was a discussion in the European Parliament. Now, once again, to say that Brexit has meant that a number of our very, let's say, active and vocal MEPs of British Asian origin basically have left, and that's left a gaping hole. But I'm reassured that many other countries have now, and I think especially there's some very, very active young Europeans of color, women who are in the parliament, and some not so young actually, but who are actually making up for the lack of British Asians. But anyway, there was a parliamentary discussion. And then the European Commission had its first ever discussion on race. I mean, that was, I think, in terms of Kekeli, you would probably agree with me, that was quite an unusual development. And then an anti-racism action plan was developed. That is, if you read it, it's really an interesting document because it talks about systemic racism. So this is something that the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel have recognized for the first time, excuse me, the existence of systemic racism. But they also talked about unconscious bias, which is something that, you know, had never been mentioned in the corridors of power here. And also started actually trying to change what I've called Brussels so white and trying to recruit, as Nima said, you know, trying to go deeper into ethnic communities and making an effort, or at least saying that they're going to make an effort. They have now advisors on diversity and inclusion. So there's been a changed conversation. And I know that in the bigger picture, this may seem like, you know, just a small development, but in terms of the European Union's so far silence on race, this has been quite an earthquake. But there are very, very important structural impediments in the way, and I'll go through them very quickly. First of all, what happens in Brussels often stays in Brussels. Brussels' impact and influence over its member states is very limited when it comes to values. We're seeing this in discussion on the rule of law. We're seeing how Hungary is dividing the EU, but it's not on LGBTIQ rights, for instance. And so the EU remains very diffident and very, I would say, impotent, really, when it comes to taking member states to task or sanctioning them or something on questions of values, and very open violation of values in the case of Muslims and Black people in many parts of the world, in many parts of Europe. And the problem is this not just an East-West problem. A lot of the racism and the Islamophobia is coming also from Western Europe. And I'm going to mention Emmanuel Macron, the French president. I'm going to mention the Austrian Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, talking very openly, engaging in anti-Muslim rhetoric with nobody ever countering them, except, of course, civil society. And this is no longer a problem of the far right. It's also been embraced by the mainstream conservative parties. I would say center-right and center-left have embraced this racist, xenophobic rhetoric, which was once the preserve of the Geert Wilders and the Marine Le Pens of the world. Just to give you a very quick example, there is a European Commissioner for the promotion of the European way of life. I mean, if that's not a dog whistle to the far right, I'd like to know what is. Somebody talked about the great replacement theory. I would say, embedded in a number of things that Europeans, policymakers say and do. The white supremacist sort of agenda is very much part of some of the discourses as well, without anyone ever calling them out. So, and my third point is that it's, as Nima has said also, it's very much about individuals, it's not systemic. I said the European Commission has acknowledged that, but in the real life, it's always about the bigots, the bad people. And so the idea that this is embedded in institutions is not really recognized overall. And now finally, I'll say the two questions that remain is, of course, the legacy of colonialism and how that's impacting on European foreign policy, security policy, development policy, trade policy, climate, etc. All of those things are yet to be challenged, yet to be talked about. I'm doing it in my writing, in my lectures, but there are very few people who are actually going that route, because that is really a Pandora's box. I mean, you open that and you see so many things coming out of it. One of the impact, I think, Kekeli, you'll agree with me, is that the relationship with Africa now is in pretty, I would say, poor shape. There hasn't been an EU-Africa summit for a year or two now. The migration issue, of course, which is embedded in racism again, is very much on the agenda. And you may have seen recently, a number of countries' leaders have come out and say they're sorry for their colonialism. And, you know, there's been some talk of generous aid donations from the Germans to the Namibian government to make up for the genocide. But these are very limited. They're not apologies, so there's no financial reparation. They're also about specific events rather than for colonialism and slavery per se. And there's very little reference also to slavery, to be quite frank. I mean, people talk about colonialism, but Europe's entanglement and participation in this trade is not something people talk about very openly. So now you have museums that were once very proud of their sort of colonial history, backtracking, changing their exhibitions, changing their explanations, making them more sort of conscious of today's sensitivities. These are things that are happening, but I wonder to what extent they're deep and embedded. And my final point really is, it is about what you have said. Who is a European today? Is it just white and Christian? Or is Europe multicultural, multi-ethnic? And we know that Europe is in desperate need of talent of all its citizens. And by excluding so many, I think 50 million is the last count. There is no data, there are no figures about how many we are, Europeans of color. But the estimate from NGOs is that it's about 50 million. So that's a nice middle size, almost a big European country with clout. And so what's happening now is that this whole issue of who is a European, am I just a foreigner? Will I always be asked, where are you really from? Or can I go out and say proudly, as I do now, I am a European and I matter? So civil society organizations are doing a great job. They're a new anti-racist organization. So we're really coming together, but it is a long road ahead, a very long road ahead. And it requires collective effort and making sure that the urgency of the issue remains on the table, because that's one of the biggest problems the EU has. It gets distracted. And we have to make sure that this is a question in the Conference on the Future of Europe, that minority groups are properly represented, and that we keep up the pressure on these easily distracted and rather narrow-minded EU politicians. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And perhaps one of the key roles that we as a European Studies community can and should play is in ensuring that that question remains on the table over the duration of the conference on the future of Europe. So something to think about and take away there in particular. Thank you very much, Shada. We'll move swiftly on with no ado to our next contribution from Kekeli Ponyon, who is the head of the Human Rights Programme at the Quaker Council for European Affairs, where she leads projects that promote a human rights-based approach to European policymaking and implementation on the topic in particular of migration. She has an academic background in migration, mobility and development, and has spent more than a decade working with migrant-led organizations and NGOs in Europe and Africa. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Kekeli, over to you.
Thanks, lovely to be here. And I feel like I'm in the lucky position that I can actually use my time to pick up from what others have shared already. So that's half of my job done. Thank you very much. And I wanted to start by I like what Shada said about the virgin birth of the European Union, and how the founding fathers, and I think the language is always interesting, came together, and Europe was a peace project. Sure, in 1957, most of European countries that came together still had empires that had not been given independence. So peace, yes, for who? That's a question that will be interesting at some point to address. I think there is that issue of short-term memory. So the EU bubble, we talk about 1957 as the beginning of everything. When it comes to migration policy, then 2017 is the beginning of when crisis happened. But I like to place, for example, if we talk about Europe migration and its nearest neighbor, the continent of Africa, the first European policy for labor migration when it came to Africa was the transatlantic slave trade, moving people for labor for European profit. And if you look at European borders.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to call it out. There we go, Declan.
Sorry. So yeah, so when we look at moving 400 odd years from the slave trade to looking at what's happening at the border currently, if you look at the Mediterranean borders, we see racialized groups, we see Africans and other people of color trying to cross into Europe in order to get safety, but also because of labor and wanting better standard of living, but left to drown in the Mediterranean. And the numbers are absolutely horrendous. Like, you take the last 10, 15 years and you talk about over 40,000 people drowning in the Mediterranean. There is something absolutely shocking when it comes to that, and looking into it bring us to the fact that it could be because those Black lives do not matter. It's and I think and as we move along European history, because Europe as an institution, but I guess we'll have the freedom to look at Europe as a continent, and again, I guess as a project. And some of the things, the way Europe portrays itself, when I talk about the Enlightenment, for example, how at the same time, you know, what was being theorized was the things around the racial superiority of European, and things that have only become more, you know, solidified as time came. We look at France and the French Revolution and democracy, and how all of that had an impact on the politics and economy of Europe. And at the same time, what is interesting but often left out when we talk about this construction of European socio-political development is Haiti, for example. The French losing to a nation of slaves, and how that shook the revolutionaries to the point that abolition had been was gained by Haiti, but France had to make the point of reinstating enslavement because of what that could inspire elsewhere, but how that it had an impact on Napoleon, which was being celebrated this year. Napoleon, and we talk about Russia, and so the impact of what Europe is doing elsewhere and on the continent is something that is missing. And I feel like this is a long, winded way to get to what does have to do with Europe, with racism in Europe. But I think it's amnesia. It's about how European histories are full of gaps and silences. And in those gaps and silences have grown some ideas of what it means to be European. And as colleagues have mentioned before, the idea of European and whiteness, and how human rights and democracy are European exports to the world without linking it with what Europe has done to the world to possibly destabilize a good chunk of the globe. There's also, and I'll take migration as an example because this is part of my portfolio, and how what is interesting is how at the moment you talk about the European discourse on migration it's about management, so migration management policies. And what I'm finding interesting is how, because race is a taboo, and last year and this year, the past, have been, as Shada said, word that we never thought would be uttered in European policy-making space come, but it has become it's still very superficial. So we take migration policies and we don't link them with integration policies. We don't link them with anti-racism policies. And we talk about second, third generation migrants, which is an impossibility technically, but how migrants has become a byword for non-white. But these are things that are still not questioned that much. And so contesting those policies on the term of the implementation is not great. And the premise that, well, migration needs to be managed. We need borders, because there's also the fixation with nation states. And how without nation states, nothing can be. But at the same time, we talk about the European Union. So I guess a solution has been hard borders and to construct that fortress around Europe. And at the same time, looking at other processes of regional integration, for example, and again, taking Africa, how there's a free movement of people agreement, and how this is giving nightmare to European institutions, because if they start moving freely on the continent, then they will make their way out and they will all come here. And how all of that are underpinned by those, by racism, but it is not spelled out and it is not acknowledged, because I feel like there's being at the receiving end of racism is bad, but actually there's nothing worse than accusing somebody of being a racist, because racism does not exist. There's no racist in EU circles. It's a kind of figment of our imagination, or it's misunderstanding, mishearing, all sorts of things, because the idea that racism is a human rights violation is not something that is considered. It's as Shada said, I feel like there's a lot of, as she said, because it's a very small circle, and I feel like sometimes we are raisins in a glass of milk, because access to spaces where those issues may or may not be discussed is very limited. But it's yes, I feel like those are, there is a lot of performance. And the loss of, I never thought I would say the thing, but the loss of the UK, it has really been felt when it comes to the discourses, because for all its fault, and having spent nearly 20 years in the UK, I know what I'm talking about, but for all its fault, the UK was one of the most progressive countries when it came to the conversation or on race, how the idea of multiculturalism was something that was more or less accepted, but how those words strike fear in European capitals, because the fear of communitarism, that all people staying together to plot the demise of whatever it is that the demise is being plotted, and how also the UK was one of the few countries, or maybe the only one who has data on racial discrimination, data on those issues of equalities, because this is something that Europe has been quite against, keeping numbers, because if we don't mention race, maybe it will disappear. But and if we don't count, if you don't look, or if you don't try to be accountable, then we can't answer the question. And truthfully, hand on heart, but really we don't know, because we do not want to know. And I think this is one of the issues that we are being left with, because confronting racism, yes, but racism is really not new. This is not something that appeared last year, the 20, 50 years ago. And the solutions to ending racism or to confronting racism are not to be found, because actually they are there. They've been spelled out for a number, for decades, centuries. If you think about some enslaved people writing account of their lives, their treatment at the end of Europeans else out of Europe, or even in Europe. But it is about the messengers, about the people carrying the message, who at the moment are not considered possibly legitimate. And I think it's a matter of wanting to end, wanting to confront rather than trying to discern the problem. And I wanted to end on a positive note, but I think what we also are seeing is a form of backlash. That there's been a lot of posturing, and allies apparently came out of everywhere, and everybody wanted to do something. But where, a year after the murder of George Floyd, where are we when it comes to any actions being taken? And it looks like, and when we see the reports coming from the UK, for example, on structural racism not existing, this is part of the backlash. This is also influencing the rest of Europe as to their position on, when you look at France and the legislation coming to curb demonstrations. It's talking about security, but actually it's on the back of this Black Lives Matter protest. This is part of the backlash. I guess my question would be, what do we do to ensure that the conversation continues, and that actually we move on from trying to discern the problem to actually tackling it?
Fantastic, thank you. And that juxtaposition, I think, is really interesting to the role that the UK had previously played in the EU in terms of data and discourse, but then also the impact and influence of this, travesty of a report is also, really interesting. I find that really fascinating, alarming, unsettling. Thank you so much, and we'll move to last, but certainly by no means least, and bring things back to Ireland, although not back to Cork. I know they'll be very disappointed, as will any other Corkonians in the audience, I'm sure. But we're delighted to be joined by Bashir Otukoya, who is an assistant professor in advanced European law in the School of Law at Dublin City University. His research interests lie in the fields of EU citizenship, national citizenship, and constitutionalism, and critical race studies. He's also a member of the National Anti-Racism Committee. So thank you, Bashir, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. It's a pleasure to be here amongst such distinguished members of the panel. And they've said so much already. I'm I suppose that's the benefit of coming last, is that I don't have to repeat what's already been said. And I suppose I could give the Irish context again, in the sense that I am a little bit jealous in the fact that you guys are coming from well-established countries that with multiculturalism embedded, with racism being a focal topic, at least in some sectors in your countries, whereas here in Ireland, it's a relatively new phenomena. It's not new in the sense that, oh, puff, here is racism. It always existed, but for the first time, it has been acknowledged in the wake of Black Lives Matter that we witnessed last year. And in terms of multiculturalism in Ireland, really, we've only seen an influx of immigration into Ireland within the last 20 years. And so hate crime legislation, for example, or racist incidents or hate crime incidents haven't traditionally been recorded properly, for example, or there hasn't been any penalties or any sanctions or any protections for victims of racism. And part of my research and part of my work as a member of the Anti-Racism Committee is trying to understand, well, why, as the members have already said, that, racism is a pandemic within a pandemic, but one pandemic was quickly resolved, well, not resolved, but, vaccines, quarantines were put in place to quickly try to eradicate this problem, but yet, for at least in America, for over 450 years, racism is still ongoing. It's ongoing here in Europe, and it exists here in Ireland as well. We mustn't forget that, members of the travelers community, for example, they make 0.6% of the current Irish population, but they've been here since the very foundation of Ireland, and they have always explained about the racism that they suffer here in this country. And And it goes back to what Kelly was saying about amnesia. We often forget about the wrongdoings of our past, but yet we have statues that signifies the greatness that certain people have done, and we neglect or forget about the horrific past that they have also done. And then comes in the cancel culture that we witnessed last year, predominantly from the youth, who are understanding that yes, we can celebrate history, but we must look to the future, and the future is diverse. And in the Irish context, it certainly is looking that way, because in 20 years ago, around 2004, the Irish citizenship laws changed. Before that, it used to be anyone born in Ireland was automatically Irish. And there was a fear of what was called refugee women coming into Ireland because of the laws back then, that they would, by virtue of their Irish-born child, automatically become Irish and therefore gain residency, and that was being an abuse of immigration systems. Anyways, the laws changed so that now you require at least one Irish parent if you are born here. And what the result of that was that 20 years on, now we have young adults, either undocumented, stateless, or certainly who are Irish by all extent, but don't have the legal certification or documentation to attest that identity. And so that's a problem with racism, systemic racism. And the problem comes from not, because we recognize racism, we don't like to accept it. We don't like to accept our wrongdoings. In the Irish context, for example, the Magdalene laundries, look how long it took us to say sorry, to use Shada's term, for the wrongdoings of the past, of the state's actions. And it's not like, it's funny, if I can borrow from my own culture, you know, when I was a teenager, I'd get in trouble, and my mother, obviously my mother would give out to me, and, you know, she'd force me to apologize, you know, say sorry, say sorry. And obviously I'd say sorry. But then she'd roll her eyes and she'd go, sorry, God, sorry, me, which basically translates to, why are you sorry for? Like, I don't need your apology now, it's too late. And I started thinking that, well, what's the purpose of saying sorry? And it hit me that the harm has already been done. You can't take back somebody. In the George Floyd scenario, for example, his life is gone. Derek Chauvin will spend some years in jails, but he's still alive. The harm has been done, the hurt has been done. And in some countries, sorry still seems to be the hardest word, Shada, if I can borrow from your article. And, you know, it's coming to terms with our past history. Those aren't our history, those are the histories of our ancestors. And so we need to recognize that acknowledging the wrongdoings of the past and then moving forward and calling out what it is, the problems of our society, such as racism, so that we can move on and deal with it in realistic and practical ways. Because we do have laws, as Kekele says, we do have laws that prescribes against racism. We have equality laws. We have Tina Swan programs here, but yeah, we still see racism as an issue in our society. There's the Race Equality Directive 2000. I teach European Union law. I've never once in my history of studying, either as a student or a lecturer, seen the Race Directive being quoted in the case law or as part of the course content. But yet, what that shows us is that we are not a part of Europe, as white Europe, as was already described earlier on. And that's an injustice to minority groups, such as Black and ethnic Asian minority groups who live here, who belong here, who've been here for decades, but yet are still being told, for example, that you are French, and that's it. Luckily for us, in the Irish context and other countries that do not follow the assimilationist process that allow dual citizenship, for example, we are allowed to have hyphenated citizenship and a duality of identities. And that, as Amanula has said earlier on, enriches our society. But enrichment is great, and the advantages are great, but we also must offer support and protections for the wrongdoings that minority groups will do face in society. And so coming to solutions, we do have solutions, but utilizing those solutions, because for example, the Race Directive says we can engage in positive discrimination, quotas, for example, where we can bring up minority groups so that they come to the level of the power relations and the power dynamics of equality that, you know, democracy actually prescribes. And so if we are to look at real and practical solutions, the first step is to be comfortable talking about these conversations, because victims of racism have had to bear that uncomfortableness all their lives. And so having a conversation, however uncomfortable it may be, it is healthy in a democratic society. That is how we move on, by looking at the past, seeing where we went wrong, saying sorry if necessary, if that will, in terms of, I don't know, fines, whatever it needs to be. Say sorry if necessary, but it's not about, you know, how do we fix the past, because we can never fix the past. It's about how do we get to a better future. And getting to a better future is, and if I'm allowed to say, because I'm a legal academic, is to borrow from one of the fundamental principles of natural justice, adi altrum partem. Hear the other side. You have to hear. Remember that when I came to Ireland as a child, I was 7. And in those days, I was basically the only Black child wherever I went. And naturally, I didn't see color. But as I grew up, I learned that not seeing color meant not seeing me and my struggles. And what that means is that if we extend that out to the ethnic minorities in our EU member states, and we're seeing that rejection in their being, and we're saying to them, if you do not conform to our values and identities and the way we are, well, then you are not a part of us. And that is an incorrect language to be teaching to children of the future in all their identities. And I think moving forward, we all must collectively move from allyship to coalition, to recognize that we do live in a democracy. That's one of the founding principles, or the general principles of EU law, is that of democracy, and that we engage. And democracy necessarily requires involvement of all those in the community, minority groups, majority groups, and then we come to a compromise on how best to work. In terms of racism, we need to come to that as well. And in getting to that, we need to see diversity at the tables, diversity and inclusion, which not only focuses on gender, but also on race, because race is a part of life. We have to start seeing color. We have to start getting comfortable with seeing differences in society, and to react to difference, not with animosity or fear or known, but with a real genuine curiosity, and the Irish do it best. We're really curious about the stories of somebody who's different. But with that curiosity, we need to remember that we shouldn't aim to satisfy our own curiosity to the detriment of somebody else. And I think moving forward, the best way to do it is to have a truly diverse European Union in terms of its agencies and its bodies and its offices and people who actually are able to implement these policies and to promote and encourage member states to utilize what we already have. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, for example, they have recommendations for each member state. For example, there are laws and policies in place readily available for us to use, but where is the will? And I think it goes back to that will, that are we ready to hear the other side, to hear the victims of racism? We've seen what the extreme end of what racism can look like. What are we now going to do about it? I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What are we going to do about it is the rallying call of this, certainly this seminar, I hope, and of this issue more widely. I'm going to now remind people that you can offer a question in the comment we've got in the comments, or in the chat rather, or if you'd like to, do feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question in person. You can do so by clicking on reactions at the bottom of the screen and using the raise hand function. While you gather, we've got about 20 minutes for questions. While you gather your thoughts, I have a question to kick us off. And one of the aims of this seminar series in general, and this seminar in particular, is to think about the similarities and differences in how the issues that we're seeking to address, in this instance, the issue of racism, manifests within and across the 3 different political communities that we are, concerned with here today: the UK, Ireland, and the EU. And I wondered, I might come to you first, Amanullah, if that's okay, because I know in a sense you have kind of 1 foot in Ireland and 1 foot in the UK, if you like. Or certainly in Scotland. And I wondered what reflections you might have on the similarities and differences in how the issue of racism manifests in these and across these two different jurisdictions, and maybe what learning there is in that for how we confront the challenge of racism across them.
Thanks, Jonathan. You said my foot's in Ireland and Scotland, but actually they're in three places. I still hold very strong roots in Sialkot, and I'm forever reminded by my mother, who tells me stories about how she bathed with buffaloes in her ancestral village. And it's just a thought that I think about, every day. But I think, the Shada actually hit it on the head in terms of what is happening. And it's something that I've said several times, and many people have said, we are living at a time where one of the biggest challenges, and if I could speak to my co-religionists, to Muslims at the moment, it is about how to live in the depths of pluralism. We have a problem of, especially some Muslims who call out Islamophobia, but they don't call out homophobia with the same breath. This really pains me, and I don't actually have a simple answer on how we deal with this. And I think this is something that, thinking about it locally in terms of how I understand it within my own Muslim communities, I'm thinking about these are some of the challenges that we face today. It's about how do we join the dots? How do we create coalitions? How do we build capacity of those that are radically different from us? These are issues that we are faced with here in Cork, in Ireland, in Scotland, and in Sialkot, where my parents have come from. And it's how to kind of allow each other, the capacity to be who they want to be. This is a huge challenge, especially as, religion is my field. My co-religionists will be very quick to damn people to hellfire, and to talk about heaven and hell in that way. The power of words is very, very strong. I worry about, you're talking about racism. I worry about this new idea that many Muslims are talking about now, which is a slight improvement about hating the sin and loving the sinner when it comes to issues of, for example, queer Muslims. That I worry about that. I worry about the damage that is done to an individual who is queer, or an individual who is being bombarded on the side of racism. That is where intersectionality comes in. That is where you have the compounding of many discriminations for that individual. I think we're not doing the joined up right. We're not joining up the dots here. And this is a challenge that we have here in Ireland. We have it in Scotland, and we have it in places like Pakistan. I don't want to offer any kind of insights, but I just thought about that as Shada was talking about that. And I think about this every time. And I think about it even in my family, where I disagree with my own siblings on issues of social injustice, but we all want to live equally. I don't have an answer to this, but I hope that we can at least begin to develop an understanding that sometimes we can't be in each other's shoes. We may try to sympathize, but what goes on with somebody else is something very, very different. I talk about racism, but I'm not Black. And I think that, this idea that, my experience is similar to what is happening to Black students at UCC is not the same, but in some way it is connected.
Thank you. The cultivation of connection without, having to create a sense of false equivalence seems really important in kind of what you're saying, I think. I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to, or have any kind of reflections on the similarities and differences. Yes, Shada.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to say, I think what we need is a conversation, but I wouldn't exclude the US from that conversation, because I think we have a lot to learn from what is happening in the United States. In many, not by, as the French would say in horror, by importing the woke culture and the cancel culture and the critical race theory and all these horrible things that Americans are exporting to allegedly, I'm just quoting the French, Islamo-leftism and all these horrible things that the French are doing at the moment, just because it's politically expedient, because they're going to be elections. And Marine Le Pen is breathing down the neck of Emmanuel Macron, or so they claim. But all of this, I think we need a conversation on racism, which is, as I think Amanullah is saying as well, which is not just about the EU or Ireland or Britain. I think there's a G20 conversation to be had, not just a G7. And I think there are, as we have learned on many things from each other, there's a conversation to be had globally on this, not within the United Nations and signing up to conventions. But Amanullah, as you know, social media allows us to create networks across the world that we never had before. I've made so many friends and allies, if I may say so, on Twitter and elsewhere, because we are working in the same direction. So I think there's a very important conversation to be had. So the coalitions should be built globally and within our territories. One more thing, I think what's happening on a national level is not always echoed on the city level. I think our municipalities and our cities are way ahead of our national politicians and actually recognizing the importance of diversity and the asset that diversity brings. So a number of politicians who are from diverse backgrounds are in the municipalities, are in provincial parliaments, are mayors of European cities. And I sometimes think they are the real people who are working on the ground. Mayors in the Netherlands, mayors in Germany are opening up their arms to migrants and refugees, saying, come, our villages are dying. We need your fresh energy and your input and your money and your labor, you know. So I think the state is also sort of too, to over-exaggerate the importance of national politicians. And my final point would be, Brussels is Brussels so white. It is, it's an ecosystem. It's not just the EU institutions, it's the think tanks, it's the media, it's the consultancies, it's the academia. And that is going to be the challenge to change, but it is being done as well. So I have hope, but it's a very slow process. And I think we have a lot to learn on positive discrimination from what's happened with the gender equality drive, from the LGBTQI drive, because those coalitions have been built and they're sometimes finding allies beyond the normal, friends and sympathizers. That's the kind of thing that has to be done also on racism. And I would put Islamophobia as part of the racist discourse. I think it has its particularities, Amanullah, but it's also very much part of the racist discourse that runs through it. You're different, and hence we don't like you. And we don't want you here, Sorry, a bit long there.
No, thank you, Shada. Ade has a question. You're welcome if you like to unmute to ask it in person if you'd like to. Although we can't hear you, unfortunately.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, got you now.
Yeah, sorry. I still had something plugged in, that's the problem. So yeah, thanks for your excellent discussion amongst your panelists. So my question is, having done some work with ENR and the RD previously, prior to the George Floyd case around Afrophobia, I would like to find out, how do you think we can actually, use what we've built in the past? I mean, we've got a resolution here in Europe to address Afrophobia. I'm sorry if my questions are specific to Afrophobia, but that's the area that I've really been working in. So how can we ensure that anti-racism norms and policies such as ICED, the RED, and new EU, and I think as recent as yesterday, there was a Council of Europe resolution which was passed. How can we ensure that they just, to use an expression that one of my professors used, they don't have any teeth? How can we ensure that they have teeth rather than, they're just sort of paper tigers with no teeth moving forward? Because that's very key. I do agree 100% with what has been said about building collaboration and coalition. That is something which we had before. And yes, as somebody who lives in the UK, I know that, we have been negatively impacted in the UK by not being a part of the European policy making process, as well as, you know, our presence being missed. So that's just what I want to put out to the panel moving forward. And yeah, I take on board 100% that we don't need to limit it to working with people within Europe, but can we not sort of try and use international policies, such as international frameworks, such as the SDGs, which is actually taking momentum in the USA. And I think the reparations movement as well has been gathering a lot of momentum. So how can we, you know, build on that? How can we build on what we have achieved in the past and move forward? Thank you.
Thanks, Ade. Would you like to address the question to anyone in particular, or will I offer it to the panel as a whole?
Well, actually, I think if you can offer it to the panel as a whole, that would probably be good, because I think you're coming from diverse backgrounds. Someone who has lived in Cork in the past and has interacted with the EU institutions and Brussels. It'll be good to hear all these different, you know, and I really appreciated hearing from Kelly and Nima also. So yes, please do. Thanks.
Thank you. What I'll do is Martin has his hand up as well, Martin Bond. So I'll take that question as well, and then I'll go through the panel as a whole, and they can offer reflections on these two questions and,
okay, thank you.
Anything else that's come up so far. Martin.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. I'm very impressed by the panel, and thank you all very much for those contributions. I've learned a stack of my notes are piled on top of each other here in front of me. But I'm left at the end still in some confusion, and I think many other people who either want to or are contributing in any case to this debate in wider circles are still groping for some clarity about a few pretty key terms and pretty key aims of the people who act in this debate. I mean, vast debate across our society, well, growing. I mean, having been much suppressed, but now growing. And if I put it this way, I think I take on board very, very clearly the distinction between what's happening in individual member states and what's happening in the EU as a whole. In particular, as Shada was saying, in Brussels, which is very much a bubble for the EU. But the EU is in a position to give leadership to several member states, not all, but to several member states. And I think that's important, that it shouldn't go wrong at the centre and then have to be tried to be corrected by other member states. And I think that what we need to know is what sort of society at the centre we want to be. Do we want to be a society which is effectively racially blind or racially more aware? Do we want to be colourblind or more integrated? Is assimilation the aim, or is community representation the aim? These are vast differences down those two different routes. Well, they're more than two different routes. 3 pairs I've offered you there, though some of them overlap. But those categories are still, to me, very confused after this panel presentation. Confused not because they're willfully confused, I think, but I think it takes time, it'll take more experience to sort them out. But sorting them out will make a quite different shape to society, either from the centre here at the EU, if we manage that, or in individual states where we have leverage, but much more locally, obviously. So can I leave that to the panel? I'm looking for more clarity, if possible, about the longer term aims.
Thanks very much. So good luck. We've got 5 minutes left, yes, to try and deal with some of these. So what I'm going to do is there are some questions there about ensuring the enforcement of existing and emerging kind of protocols and laws, legal frameworks around confronting and tackling racism, as well as a more conceptual question about what that work should seek to be doing and what the result might look like. And I'll also offer the opportunity here to offer kind of concluding remarks as well to each of the panelists to kind of bring us to a conclusion. If I could just ask you to mute yourself again there. There we go. Brilliant. So I'll go in turn. in terms of how the speakers spoke, and offer up those questions as well as an opportunity for any final reflections. If you could keep those reflections quite short, then we should be able to wrap up more or less on time, although I'm anticipating a degree of overrun here. But Nima, I'll come to you first on those questions and on any other reflections that you might like to offer.
Yeah, so I'll keep it very brief. I just responding to the last question about what kind of approach we take. I think we really need to change hearts and minds, and it's going to take a long time. I don't think colorblindness is the answer. It actually serves racism a lot of the time in ignoring discrimination, or saying that the implication that racism or being a victim of racism is a state of mind, and if you don't feel like a victim of racism, then that means you're not a victim of racism, when actually these are all structurally embedded in our health outcomes, and financially, and in all respects. And I think these questions around integration and assimilation, I'm always like, what am I integrating into? What am I assimilating into? When my ancestors were invaded, and when different colonies were looted and pillaged, and women raped and violence occurred, we didn't ask them. The colonizers didn't integrate, and now that we're here, we're being told to integrate into a white European way of life. And I think Kelly mentioned this as well, about the Enlightenment values and European values and British values are seen as superior to the rest of the world, and the racial superiority of white Europeans permeates the whole world. And I don't want to accept the terms of the debate that I need to integrate or I need to assimilate. When my ancestors were colonized, they weren't. The colonizers weren't integrating in those countries. They took whatever they wanted, and did the damage. And we're still, a lot of the global south is still paying the price. So I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you, and here. Amanullah, I'd like any final reflections and/or answers to those two questions.
Thank you. I would just like to urge every university in Ireland to set up a race equality forum. I would like to see more university leadership on identifying and naming racism on our campuses, and to join the dots with our Athena Swan Charter and the Race Equality Charter in some way, how we do that. I think there has to be more political leadership who acknowledge and accept racism, and speak more about it. That will be helpful as well. And I think all of these issues will allow more conversations to take place. There's no cookie cutter, way to identify and to, we know what the problem is, but how do we deal with it? How do we actually empower individuals to feel safe and secure in society? That's an individual thing. And I think part of the problem is we need to, in my view, we need to talk more and train less. I find it absolutely baffling that there are universities and institutions and organizations and corporate organizations can use all sorts of academic flowery language to say, oh, you know what, there's this unconscious bias. We can take the racism out of you. We can take the homophobia out of you. What we need is at a very simple level, we need to have more conversations with people who are radically different from you. And I'm sorry to use religious tropes here, but we have to draw closer to our neighbor who is radically different and may want to live that life very different from their neighbor. So again, I think on the question of what is it, integration, assimilation, it's part of that great panoply of colors of how people want to fight racism, what they want to do, and what they want to do in public. We have to find the capacity and empower those individuals in whatever way they want to do it by lifting everybody up. And that can happen through more conversations and from drawing closer to one another.
Thank you very much. Shada, the same offer to you.
Yes, with the 3 points, I've been very struck by what Nima said about how ethnic minorities and people of color don't feel connected to the EU. And I think that that is a real credibility problem for the European Union as it tries to strike itself as a kind of a global power. And this is going to come to haunt them. So I would really advise the Europeans to make a real effort for the EU policymakers to reach beyond their comfort zone and to connect with citizens, whatever their color. And that is important. The problem of EU leadership that Martin pointed to, really trammeled by politics and political maneuvering that goes on. I mean, I'm going to name names here, but if you have the conservatives and the European, I'm sorry, I don't mean conservative groups such as the European People's Party, which allowed Fidesz of Hungary to stay within and really had problems. I think they've suspended them now because that just shows that it's politics above values. And this is a real problem, even within the European Commission. And there you'll see it. And finally, also to Martin's point, I'd say for me, it's about inclusion, building societies which are inclusive and which are racially aware, but also inclusive in terms of other vulnerable groups. The problem comes often, I see Bashir nodding, problem comes often, the us and them attitudes come in because there is concern, jealousy, envy that some groups are being given special treatment. So we have to be sure that we don't do that. If we're building spaces, we're building facilities, it has to be open to all vulnerable groups, and that includes racialized people, but beyond. So inclusion, I would say. And then finally, we need allies. And without allies in high places, and we don't have them at the level of the European Union. There is no EU leader apart from Merkel, who sometimes shows a little bit of awareness, wokeness, if you like. Apart from her, who she's leading, there is not a single leader in the EU who will stand up today and say that he believes in an inclusive and diverse society. Not a single one.
Thank you. I'm going to enjoy the idea of Merkel as woke for the rest of the afternoon. Brilliant. Kekele, the same to you.
I will take both. I think the Ade's and Martin questions to me are linked. I think for policies, as you say, that have truth, they have to be made from coming from a place of empathy and understanding. This is not because policymakers do not come fully formed, and that's where it's about the whole of society. It's about education. How are children educated, and what do they grow into, and what do they put in the work that they do, in the way they live as neighbors, as policymakers, anywhere. I think these and how empathy needs to be at the core of that, and education with all those gaps, well, will continue producing the results that we see now. I also think that it is about what kind of society do we want? We want societies where, and it goes to the point of Amanullah, it is about societies where people are considered as fully human. Everybody is fully human, and it's not about categories of people. It's about accepting different ways of being. And I think sometimes whiteness forget that it is just an identity, and there's the idea that, well, this is the only way of being, that's how the whole world should be, but actually there are other as valid ways of being a human being. And it's about the idea that we all share the globe. So it is about how do we find ways to live on it in a way that sustain everybody. And I think it is about it's about the pluriverse. We talk about universalism, yes, but at the same time, what happened to a pluriverse where we all share common purpose, but we are free to just be however works, and respecting all human rights for everybody everywhere, not just some for some people somewhere as well, but accepting localized ways of being. And it's also linked, and we're talking about racism, but also ways linked to sustainability. It's linked to the environmental crisis, and what can there be learned from out there, because it's also that Europe might not be the paragon of knowledge that it think it is, and it's about how do we learn from the people who have been pushed to the margin.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And finally, again, and apologies, but as I said earlier, by no means least, Bashir, the final word is all yours before we draw things to a conclusion.
It's perfect, because it just means I could just summarize what has already been said. And I think the overall point that's being made is that we need to start seeing one of the core principles of the EU, that of equality, and to stop seeing equality as sameness. That worked in our history when we were homogeneous, member states were homogeneously white. But as time progressed, after the World War IIs, and nation states became more diverse, that principle of equality and sameness no longer works. As society becomes more diverse, equal measures will not be applied equally for everybody, and therefore you have the differences in treatment that we have today, and what we call discrimination and so forth. And so really we should move beyond seeing equality as sameness towards seeing equality as equity, that in a manner such as positive discrimination, for example, that when we recognize that, for example, that other people need a leg up. We saw that with gender. We saw that in other areas. We saw that with LGBTQI and so forth. So why can't we have the same approach with race? The answer is we can, but where is the will? Which goes back to Ade's question in terms of, well, can we force member states to do something? Well, not really, no, because international agreements are, they are soft law, so to speak, because you can't force member states to do anything about it. So it really goes down to the will of the people in the member states, and what's already been said in terms of solution and how we address that, you can have regards to that. Luckily, in the Irish situation, just to bring it back home, Jonathan, if that's okay, in the Irish context, we actually have that prescribed in our constitution. Now, it was prescribed without any racial kind of intentions in mind. It was designed with the relationship with Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And so what that says is that we recognize the diversity of the Irish nation. I'm forgetting the actual terminology, but it actually uses, it is the firm will of the Irish people to acknowledge and accept, I forgot the actual terminology, but to recognize the diversity of our nation. And I think borrowing from the Irish Constitution, I don't know if it's replicated in other member states, but to kind of go back to Martin's point about it, well, is it assimilation or integration? Well, to put it bluntly, and I teach international law, look at anywhere there has been terrorist incidents in EU member states. There's always a correlation to ethnic minority groups who don't feel or are not treated like they belong in that member state that they're residing in. For example, I was in the Netherlands 2 years ago on research, and I stayed there for 3 months. I'll make it quick, sorry, and I'm taking people's time. And I went there, I'm like, oh my God, this place is so diverse. I'm seeing bank managers that are Black compared to Ireland, for example. And, I conducted, informal interviews with people I met in an Irish pub, Black people. And you say, oh, this place is great. There's no racism. Like, bro, there's racism here, bro. There's racism. I'm like, but I don't see it. And as we went on, I talked about questions of identity. I said, well, do you identify as Dutch? Like, no, bro, I'm from Côte d'Ivoire. And I'm like, but you grew up here, you were born here. And suddenly I see the difficulties with assimilation was when you strip people of their ethnic origins, when you strip them of their culture and you say, if you want to be European, you have to be white and have all these values in mind, one of which is equality. And we say, oh, we don't see colorblind, we treat everybody the same here. But the problem with that is that equal treatment does not necessarily lead to the same outcome. And we can see that in employment law, for example. And so without going too much, to summarize the answer again, we need to start looking at equality, not as sameness, but valuing it as differences. And what can we do to ensure everybody has a more equitable way of life? Thank you.
Fantastic. It behoves me at this stage just to thank again all of the contributors to today's discussion and to thank you all for attending. Apologies for the very slight overrun, and thank you all for sticking with us to the end. This is the second of 3 of these joint seminars, so please do keep your eyes peeled, keep an eye out for information that will be forthcoming in due course about the third and final these sessions. And finally, again, I'm sure you'll all like to join me in thanking our speakers. I'm only sorry that now we're all going to log out and we're not going to be able to have a further discussion over coffee and or other beverages of choice. But I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you, and thanks very much.